actual architecture from a technical perspective for a moment, and we're going to clarify a few things there too. Starting with an actual misunderstanding, which is the misunderstanding I'm talking about is this drawing. And this actually looks a bit like the first flow I was showing, where we had your data and then Tableau desktop, server, and then the consumer. So, that's what it looks like from a consumer perspective, but that's not actually what it is technically. This is actually wrong. And what's wrong in this is this arrow here in the middle, because your app doesn't actually, and the app can be, again, a portal or a web application, but that app doesn't actually communicate to Tableau Server. There is no interaction between those two directly. The way that you embed a Tableau Server view in an application is only by adding code that refers to Tableau Server, and that code is typically HTML or JavaScript for embedding. But because of that, because of how that works, your application is not actually going to communicate with Tableau Server. In fact, it's going to be the user's browser and their machine that knows from those instructions in the code to either go and look at one. So maybe, if I'm looking at this little cell phone here, they're opening the application. Well, first they will load your app's web page, and they'll tell them, that code will say, hey, there's a component here, and that you need to get from Tableau Server here. And it's your device who's going to be communicating separately with both. And there's not going to be anything like a bridge between the two, as is indicated here. So that doesn't exist. There is still a dotted line here because when we talk about trusted authentication, then yes, there is some interaction, but in general, from an architecture perspective, unless you use that, there is going to be no communication directly between the two. It's going to actually be the device who looks at one and then the other, and does whatever communication that needs to happen. And that's important because that will kind of change of how our solution architecture looks like. And in fact, we're going to focus on Tableau Server here. This is now being indicated in the top right corner as the solution itself, because this is just a box that we've used to represent it in the past few slides, but there is more to this. So how do you architect this kind of solution? And for those of you who have done some application architecture, this is not going to be very different, and we're not going to go into detail here, but this is just the architecture you have for most application or most applications, plural, sorry. This is just an inspirational document that we use to draw with clients, where we work on this together, kind of a whiteboarding approach, and we put everything in their scenarios, and we adjust what's needed. But it comes down to having your actual Tableau server hosted on a VM in the cloud or on-prem. That's being fronted by application load balancers, for example. There can be, if this is an AWS example, which is the case here, you can have CloudFront and a web application firewall even in front of that. That works, to do your actual load balancing. Well, actually, the load balancing happens here. Sorry, but the traffic comes into that firewall and then load balancer for the domain, and it gets through, etc. I mean, I'm confusing myself here now by trying to be too technical, and I shouldn't. But the point is, this actually looks to the trained eye like a very generic application setup. This is not very different from what you're used to. And again, this is something that you'd want to design carefully, obviously for security purposes, and from a technical perspective, wanting to make sure that your analytics.domain.com get properly forwarded through the right load balancer, etc., etc. But all of that is just, an exercise that you can typically do, or that as a partner we can do with you, and it's all about putting the right things in the right place, having your development and pre-production and production environments, etc. All of that's a part of this discussion. But that's really more thorough and is again, very, very, very different from one situation to another, and is something that is very interesting to discuss for those specific situations. But I guess the key takeaway is, the way that Tableau Server sits next to your application and how that's going to integrate in your environment, if that's going to be Tableau Online or not, etc. Those decisions, as have been discussed in the past few or in the past 25 minutes, are the ones that you're going to want to make